In this video, we're going to be talking about the basics of rotations. We are not yet going to be talking about the alignment of teams on the court in serve-receive. That will be in part 3. In this part, we're going to focus on tracking the rotation of players as they move around the court as a set progresses. But some understanding of rotations is required in order to identify overlaps. For example, we can't determine if our left back is overlapping our center back unless we can look at the court and determine who our left back and center back are supposed to be. Before we start, we need to add a bit of terminology. In the last video, we talked about the position of opposite, or sometimes called right side hitter. The term opposite has an additional meaning when it comes to lineups and rotations. Players that are separated in the lineup by 3 spots are called opposite to each other on the court. So as we see in the diagram, the right back and left front are opposite to each other, the center back and center front are opposite, and the left back and right front are opposite. Players that are opposite to each other remain so as they rotate as a set progresses. So let's say that player number 15 and player number 20 are separated by 3 spots in the lineup. So when number 15 is in right back, number 20 will be in left front. When the teams rotate, number 15 will move 1 spot to center back, and number 20 will advance 1 spot to center front, but they're still opposite to each other. If we advance 2 more spots, we'll see that number 15 will have rotated to left front, and number 20 will have rotated to right back. And again, they are still opposite to each other. And this illustrates another point, that in an opposite pair, you'll always have one of the players in front row and the other in back row. Tracking rotations should not just be an exercise in trying to memorize 6 numbers in order. Instead, we're going to use our basic knowledge of player positions that we talked about in video 1 to help us understand and track rotations. A team's lineup usually includes 2 outside hitters, 2 middle blockers, 1 opposite, and 1 setter. And as we talked about in part 1, there may be a DS in there in place of a back row opposite or outside hitter, and a libero will often replace a back row middle blocker. So let's build an example starting a rotation for a team. Teams often begin with a setter in the right back position or in right front if they're receiving, so that the setter will be the first server. But it varies from team to team. There's no rule about where the setter needs to begin the set. But in our example, let's have the setter begin in right back. The opposite will be opposite the setter in the lineup. So if our setter is starting in right back, that means our opposite will be starting in left front. The 2 middle blockers will be opposite each other, usually 1 spot ahead of the setter and the opposite. So with the setter in right back, 1 middle will be in center back, and the other middle in center front. And MB1 and MB2 are not 2 different positions. I've just noted it that way for clarity as we track the rotations. The 2 remaining spots are the outside hitters. With the setter in right back, that would put outside hitters in left back and right front, opposite to each other. And notice that means you'll always have one of the outside hitters in front row. So this would be the team's lineup on the court, as R2 is checking lineups at the start of the set before any libero replacement. And just to say again, setter starting in right back is just our example here. The setter could start anywhere, and the other players would just be rotated around, but in the same relative position to each other. After our lineup is checked at the start of the set, we can have our initial libero replacement. By far the most common strategy used by teams is for the libero to replace the middle blocker. That's not a rule. It would be perfectly legal for a team to have the libero replace the outside hitter in the back row. But in our example here, we'll go with the situation that's by far the most common, which is the libero replacing the middle blocker in the back row. And notice that when that happens, now the libero is opposite the middle blocker who's in the front row. Notice also that if the libero replaces the middle blocker in the back row, the libero is now one spot ahead of the setter in the rotation. And that is a pattern that we can use to help us track rotations. I put an asterisk there because I am going to come back and expand on this a little more in a couple of rotations. Now let's advance the team by one step, and the setter has rotated to center back. Notice though that everyone who was opposite to each other in the last rotation is still opposite to each other. The setter and opposite are opposite. The libero and front row middle blocker are opposite, and the two outside hitters are opposite. On some teams, a defensive specialist may sub in for that outside hitter who's rotating to the back row. In our example here, let's say that doesn't happen and the outside hitter stays in to play back row. We mentioned that tracking rotations can help us notice libero violations. When we see a team receiving serve with the libero in the left back position, that should trigger a little alert in our mind that when the team wins serve, the libero is going to have to do something. They can't just rotate because that would put them in the front row. The libero will either need to come out or they will need to serve if they've not already served in a different position in the set. In our example, we're just starting the set, so let's say the libero will serve. When a libero moves to serve, we actually have two libero replacements occurring during the same dead ball. The middle blocker that the libero had replaced comes back in, and the libero replaces the middle blocker who would be rotating to the back row. And those two replacements would be recorded on the libero tracking sheet. What we see visually when that happens, though, is that the libero does not leave the court, but instead goes straight back to serve. And what we see is one middle coming back in and the other going out behind the attack line for the libero replacement. Once that double replacement is complete, we have the libero in the right back position to serve. But notice the pattern still exists that the libero is opposite the middle blocker in the front row. With the setter in left back, the libero can't be one spot ahead of the setter anymore, of course, because the libero can't be in the front row. But notice that now the libero is one spot ahead of the setter's opposite. So the more general statement of the pattern is that if the libero is replacing middles, they will be one spot ahead of either the setter or the setter's opposite. The next rotation would bring the setter to the front row. So what happens now will depend on which offensive system the team is using. If they're using a 6-2, another setter will sub in for the opposite. And the first setter may come out in favor of another opposite who will play in the front row. If that's what the team does, notice that we are really back to the original rotation with the setter in right back. And everything that we've just seen will happen again as the second setter rotates across the back row. We mentioned in part 1 the importance of tracking whether our setter is front row or back row in order to be aware of the potential for illegal back row attacks and blocks. If a team uses this pattern, that's fairly easy for us because we know the team's setter is always in the back row. For some teams using a 6-2 system, the second setter will come into play back row, but the first setter, instead of coming out, will rotate to the front row and play as an opposite. In other words, when she's in the front row, she's going to hit instead of set. In terms of our back row awareness for the setter, it's still the case here that our primary setter is always in back row for this team. However, our first setter is still on the court, so we have to adjust our awareness about her. For the prior rotations, when she was in the back row, of course, she could not go up to the net and put the ball over or block. But now she's in the front row and she is allowed to do those things. If, on the other hand, the team is using a 5-1 system, the setter would rotate to the front row and would continue to set as a front row player. And the opposite may remain in the set as well and play as a back row player. It's when a team is using a 5-1 that we need to be most diligent about tracking rotations and the status of the setter, and remind ourselves before every point whether the setter is front row or back row. On some teams using the 5-1 system, a defensive specialist will sub in for the opposite who would be rotating to the back row. And let's say that's what the team will do in our example. If a team uses that pattern of a DS subbing in for an opposite in the back row, it can offer us a clue in tracking the status of the setter. Because if we see the DS is on the court, we know the setter must be front row. Let's advance the team one more rotation, putting the setter now in center front. Notice that since the DS replaced the opposite, it's now the DS who is opposite the setter. Notice also that we're once again in a rotation where the libero is in left back. So when that team is receiving, that again should trigger that little mental alert for us that when the team wins serve, the libero is going to have to do something. They can't just rotate to the front row. If, as in our example, the libero has already served in another position, then the libero will need to come out when the team wins serve. And here we see that replacement when the team wins serve and rotates, with the middle blocker that the libero had replaced coming back into the front row, and the other middle blocker rotating to right back to serve. And of course, the team could, if they wished, sub in a serving specialist in place of that middle to serve. And once the team loses serve, the libero could come back in to replace that back row middle. The next rotation brings the setter back to right back. And if the team had used a DS, the opposite would sub back into the front row, and now we are back to the team's original starting rotation. Now let's summarize a few of the clues we can use in tracking rotations that we've seen in the course of our example. First, if we know the setter's position, we know where her opposite should be, opposite the setter. We also know where the libero should be. Assuming the libero is replacing middles, the libero will be one spot ahead of the setter or the setter's opposite. On the other hand, if we lose track of the setter's position, we can work back from where the libero or the opposite is to find where the setter should be. If we know the libero's position, we also know where her opposite front row middle should be. And once again, with the caveat that it's not required that the libero replace middles. That's what we've used in our example and what's by far the most common. If, on the other hand, the libero is replacing outside hitters, then of course it would be the outside hitter that would be opposite the libero, and the libero would be one spot behind the setter in the rotation. We also know as we track rotations that if we know where the setter, the opposite, the libero, and the middle should be, that puts the outside hitters in the two remaining spots, one in front row, one in back row, opposite to each other. A few other tips for tracking the setter. Officials, particularly R1, should try to identify who a team's setters are during warm-ups. And then you can look at the lineup sheet to see which of them is in there and where they'll be starting at the beginning of set 1. And then you can confirm that by identifying where they are on the court as R2 is checking lineups at the beginning of a set. Sometimes things come up during warm-ups and your attention is drawn away and you're not able to do this. Sometimes that happens, but really it's much less desirable as an R1 if you're having to spend the first couple of rallies trying to figure out who's who. I've also had an instance where there was an illegal back row block by a setter on the very first rally before she had even executed a set. And you really don't want to start out a match by missing a call on the first rally. Another thing that can be helpful is to note the relative positions of the setters in the two teams' rotations. Here's an example of what I mean by that. Let's say, for instance, a team begins serving with their setter in the right back position and the opponent's setter is in the right front position, one step behind. Then, when the opponent wins serve, their setter will rotate to right back, and the two setters will be in the same position, both in right back. Then, when serve is regained, our setter moves to center back. The opponent's setter is in right back, once again, one step behind. When the opponent wins serve and rotates again, now we're back to the setters being in the same position, both in center back. As the set progresses, the setters will continue to move in that step-by-step pattern relative to each other. Now, of course, the setters won't always begin one step apart as they did in this example. But whatever relationship they begin in relative to each other, they will continue in that relationship as they rotate around. So if you lose track of where one setter is in the rotation, you can often use the position of the other setter to help you get your bearings back. Hopefully, the material in this video will help you be better at identifying who is supposed to be where on the court in terms of left back, center back, right front, etc. In the next video, we'll look at alignment at serve and look at how teams often arrange the players on the court in the different rotations.